Well, I have had a pretty full weekend with Memorial Day so far, just sort of being out and about doing a couple of different things. And it's got me thinking, what was I up to about this time last year? And I was thinking about this week, and what I was in the middle of last year, my wife, Louise, and I, we were in the middle of house hunting in Wake County. And what a joyful experience that is. For the better half of the first half of last year, we were house hunting. We were looking and searching very intently on finding a house of our own. And so that meant, in addition to our jobs and everything else we were doing during the day, we were spending untold number of hours scouring real estate websites and driving around different neighborhoods in the area of Fuquay-Varina where we were renting, trying to find our dream house. And so if you ever want to know anything about Zillow or how frustrating that website can be, come talk to me. We can have a good, long conversation about that. But it took the better part of a couple of months to really work through this. And we were working alongside our realtor, who was a really awesome Army wife named Autumn, and she knew how to take care of business. If you ever want someone who can take care of business, find an Army wife, find an Army spouse. They will work for you like nothing else. And so with her help and with all the information that's available to those who are looking to buy a house, we looked at a whole lot of houses, went and toured all sorts of places, and you just wouldn't believe the type of things that people were trying to sell at the prices they're trying to sell them at. But as we toured some of these homes, we liked some of them, and so we put offers down on a couple of these houses, but to no luck. And that's pretty much what happens when you're house hunting in one of the hottest markets in the country. There is never going to be enough supply to keep up with the demand. And because of that, a lot of the houses that we really like the most, well, they are being sold in less than a day. That's crazy. Now, obviously, having your dreams denied on a fairly consistent basis can lead you to think that it's never going to work out. You're never going to find a house of your own. But as we learn throughout this process, God's plans are always better than our biggest dreams. In the same neighborhood where we've been renting since we got married, there was a beautiful house that we'd noticed time and time again. It was a simple house with a nice front porch and a really beautiful yard. I'm talking good grass. And full disclosure, I'm a yard guy. So this house had me hooked from the first time we just walked around the block and saw it. And I'm pretty sure that even if the house had been a wreck on the inside, I think I still would have tried to buy it just for the grass alone. Louisa would have had other plans about that, though, let me just tell you. But, surprisingly enough, this house came on the market. And in what can only be described as a God thing, within 24 hours, it was ours. It was amazing. And we couldn't believe it. There we go. Yes, we were so happy. That was August 1 last year. That was a hot morning. And when you start realizing how much you just had to give over for a down payment, it'll make you sweat even more. But it was a beautiful day. It was a beautiful house. And we just couldn't believe that it finally worked out. And it was just amazing to us that this house, 2 streets over from where we had already been renting a home, was the house that God had decided to make our home. And while I was excited about the house, obviously, and the yard especially, I think the one thing I was most excited about at this moment was getting to meet our neighbors and hopefully developing the kind of relationships that my family had growing up with the neighbors that we lived around. And so because of that mindset, I sort of halfway expected as we were moving in to have neighbors stop by to say hello and introduce themselves, neighbors stopping by to lend a hand, or even at least neighbors stopping by to bring a pie or some sort of dessert. I was really hoping for the dessert. I'm a sweets guy. But none of that really happened. No one stopped by to lend a hand. No one dropped off any pies, much to my chagrin. And really no one walked across the street or came up to the door to introduce themselves. Now, I don't share these details with you to paint my neighbors as unfriendly or unkind. On the contrary, we've been able to meet a whole lot of them since we moved in last year, and they're all very wonderful people. No, I share these details with you because building relationships with the people that we live around is hard work. It's just hard work. That is what it is. And what I realized as we moved into our house was that we couldn't just wait around and expect our neighbors to form relationships with us. If anything, we were going to have to form relationships with our neighbors. Now, chances are many of you have found yourselves in a similar situation over the years. And if you have, you're not alone. Few Americans today say that they know their neighbors' names, and far fewer report interacting with them on a daily basis. A couple of years ago, the General Social Survey reported that only about 20% of Americans spent regular time with the people they live around. And 30% of the people who took the survey, they said that they had never interacted with their neighbors before. Gosh, that's some sad statistics to share. I mean, even so, there are a couple of contributing factors which have led to increasing isolationism in our neighborhoods. For starters, Americans today have more ways than ever before to use the limited time and attention they possess. Also, thanks to increased connectivity around the world, we're able to spend more time interacting with the people that we care about and love the most, regardless of where they are. Not to mention all the time that we spend in front of a screen, too, am I right? We are so bad about that nowadays. In fact, this survey mentioned that even just a few years ago, the average American was spending 19 hours per week in front of the TV. That's nuts. But regardless of the reason, we're spending less time building relationships with our immediate neighbors. And while that's harmful for us as Americans, that's especially harmful for us as Christians. Quite literally, we're missing the mark as people of faith if we're not building relationships with and witnessing to our neighbors. That's because I believe that wherever God has planted you and your family, that's your primary mission field. That's the place, and those are the people that you're called to reach with the love of Christ. Now, being a 21st century neighbor means that your mission is more complicated than ever before. But thankfully, the way in which you're called to make it less complicated is actually quite simple. That's because being a Christian neighbor just means stepping out, stepping up, and setting the example. In today's sermon, we're going to talk through some practical ways that you can accomplish any of those steps, regardless of how old you are or where you live. But before we begin, I want to share something with you, and I want to share it in love. You can't do any of this on your own. You can't do any of this on your own. To build the type of relationships you need to build, to experience the type of community that God has placed you into, and to bear witness to the incredible love of Jesus Christ, you have to remain in Christ, and He has to remain in you. Listen to what Jesus says here in John chapter 15, verse 5. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. While it's important to introduce yourselves to your neighbors, it's much more important to introduce your neighbors to Jesus. And by finding the source of your strength and your motivation in Him, you'll be able to show your neighbors what it's like to be rooted in Christ, to offer them a glimpse of the difference that Jesus makes in your life every day, and to hopefully encourage them to consider the difference that Jesus can make in their lives as well. So, with that disclaimer out of the way, let's start focusing our attention on stepping out, stepping up, and setting the example. Now, to start with, we begin with stepping out. And the reason we're starting here is pretty simple. In order for your neighbors to know you, they first have to know that you exist. I know it sounds crazy, but in order for your neighbors to know you, they first have to know that you exist. Let me give you an example. After Louisa and I moved into our house last August, we spent a lot of time inside the house, getting things in order, putting stuff away, cleaning all that stuff. And because of that, we weren't spending a whole lot of time outside. So unless they happened to catch us while we were pulling into the garage or checking the mail, our neighbors would have never known we even existed. Y'all, it's hard for people to care about us if they don't even know we exist. It's even harder for us to build relationships with those people if we're not even willing to step out and make ourselves accessible to the people around us. Friends, I understand just how easy it is to stay hidden and isolated within our dorms, apartments, and homes. To stay confined to a place that's safe, a place that's comfortable, a place that's known. In a lot of ways, stepping out exposes you to your neighbors and to the world, and it makes you accessible to people, relationships, and problems that you otherwise might avoid. But y'all, how in the world can we take the Great Commission seriously if we aren't even willing to step out and show our neighbors that we exist? How can we possibly bear witness to the radical love, acceptance, and forgiveness of Jesus Christ if we aren't willing to be that witness where we live? During his earthly ministry, Jesus saw firsthand how reluctant people like us were to step out and bear witness to his love. To encourage those people in us to step out nonetheless, though, Jesus said these words in Matthew 5, verses 14 through 16. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Whether you realize it or not, God's positioned you to be his light in your neighborhood. And because of that, you have a responsibility to let God's light shine through your life. You're not supposed to keep it hidden behind your houses, doors, and windows. As Jesus says, you're supposed to step out and to share that light with everyone. And in order to do so, the first thing you need to do is to step out and be accessible to the people around you. You need to show them that you exist. You know, ever since the weather turned warm, I've been stepping out quite a bit in my yard recently to take care of the grass and other things outside. So that means for a couple hours each week, I'm outside and accessible to the people that I live around. And let me tell you, even doing something as simple as that has allowed me to receive the blessings of God in meeting people that I didn't even know existed, and vice versa too. In fact, there's one corner of my yard that seems to sort of be holy ground for me around this time of year, because I find myself meeting new people day after day, all while I'm working in this one part of the yard. And whether it's couples out walking dogs, kids riding bikes, or people just stopping by to admire the grass, trust me, we get those. It's good grass, but I didn't make it that way. The guy before me did, so I'm not bragging about it here. But regardless of that, our neighbors are slowly realizing that we exist, and we're slowly realizing that they exist too. And while I haven't found myself preaching to our neighbors on the street corner yet, I know that God's light has a better chance of shining bright when I'm outside and accessible, as opposed to when I'm inside and isolated. That's just one way I'm trying to be the light of Christ where I live. It's not a perfect science, and it's not always easy. But how can you prayerfully consider how God is calling you to step out and to be his light where you are? Now, moving along, our next step is stepping up. Now, in addition to stepping out, we as Christians also need to be focused on stepping up in our neighborhoods too. That's because when we're presented with opportunities to engage with the people around us, we as Christians need to be the ones to step up and initiate contact first. We can't just wait around for someone to initiate contact with us, Because chances are, if we won't, they won't either. For better or worse, we live in a day and an age where we're hypersensitive about people's privacy, right? We're all really aware of that, especially in the Wake County area. And the last thing anybody wants to do is to come off as rude or intrusive against somebody else. And because of that, we're hesitant to engage with the people around us, and the people around us are hesitant to engage with us. Now, well, we could easily spend the rest of our time this morning feeling sad about the fact that people like us and people not like us don't want to engage as much as they used to. Doing so is not going to do anybody any good. Luckily, Jesus knew that we'd one day find ourselves in a situation like this, and that's why he taught us this very, very important lesson from Luke 6, verse 31. And it says this: "Do to others as you would have them do to you." Do to others as you would have them do to you. Now, friends, that's what we call the golden rule. Even if you're not a Christian, I guarantee you've probably heard of that rule at some time or another. And when Jesus gave us this rule, he quite literally changed the way that we view our world, our neighborhoods, and our relationships. Because as it relates to your relationships with your neighbors, the answer to your problem isn't to sit home throwing a pity party because no one's coming over to hang out with you. No, according to Jesus here in Luke 6, it's not on them to engage with you, it's on you to engage with them. Now listen to Jesus' words one more time. Do to others as you would have them do to you. Now, Jesus isn't telling us to just wait around until people change their minds, is he? Now, instead, Jesus is telling you to step up and to be the change you want to see in your neighborhoods. If you want to build relationships with your neighbors, if you want to let your light shine for Christ where you live, you're first going to have to step out and step up to the challenge of being the first one to initiate contact with the people around you. And, let me be the first to tell you that this is a challenge for extroverts and introverts alike. But, thanks to a recent study, we know that it's not nearly as challenging as we think. A couple of years ago, a psychologist from the University of Chicago, Nicholas Epley, he began to notice something strange. See, each day, Nicholas would commute to the university on public transit there in Chicago. But instead of seeing people, who are the most social animals on the planet, interacting with each other, he instead saw them actively ignoring each other. And as he did, and as a psychologist, he began to ask himself, why on earth do people do that? It runs totally counter to their nature. Well, he could think of two possible reasons. The first was that maybe we enjoy interacting with our friends and our family, but interacting with strangers is the worst. The other was that conversations with strangers actually aren't that bad, but we mistakenly predict them to be. So, to discover the truth behind what he calls this antisocial paradox, Epley set out to test these two hypotheses. In the first of several experiments, commuters were approached before hopping on the metro train toward Chicago. Some were instructed to have a conversation with whoever sat down next to them. Some were told to just keep to themselves and stay quiet. And some were told to do what they normally do. Afterwards, they mailed in surveys describing their experience, both how much they enjoyed the ride and how productive they felt during it. Well, out of those three groups, those in the conversation condition reported the most positive train ride, while those in the solitude condition reported the most negative train ride. Among those who talked, the longer the conversation, the better. What's more, there were no differences in ratings of productivity. Either people who were riding the train didn't feel very productive to begin with, or those conversations with strangers were actually productivity enhancing. In other experiments, Epley and his researchers simply asked commuters to imagine taking part in that first experiment. across the board, these people who imagine what this experience would be like, they imagine it would be difficult, awkward, and nearly impossible to have a productive and enjoyable conversation with a stranger. Now, did you catch that? It's a very subtle distinction between those two experiments. When people didn't step up, they imagined that interacting with strangers would be the absolute worst. But when they did step up, they realized that there was nothing to be afraid of at all. If anything, Epley's research shows us that the challenge of building relationships with our neighbors, it isn't as challenging as we think. Everyone, both talkers and loners alike, like conversation. The joy of small talk they found is mutual. You know what that means for us in our neighborhoods? Because we're going to take that out of the subway and onto the streets. It means that the hurdles which prevent us from engaging with the people we live around, they aren't as high as we thought they were. If anything, they're much, much lower. Regardless of where you live or the people you live around, your neighbors will engage with you if you step up and initiate contact with them. Just like you, they're humans. They're thirsty for social interaction. They're hungry for relationships. And they may just be ready to form a relationship with you. But you'll never know for sure unless you step up to the plate and cross the street and say hello. You'll never know for sure unless you walk down the street, ring a doorbell, and invite that new family that just moved in over for dinner. You'll never know for sure the amazing ways that God can use you unless you step out and step up for Him. In the Gospel of Luke, we hear the story of a man who desperately wanted to build a relationship with Jesus. But because of his size, his profession, and his standing in the community, he thought that no one would ever want to be in a relationship with him, especially Jesus. So instead of trying to actively engage with Jesus when Jesus was passing through his neighborhood, this man by the name of Zacchaeus, he instead climbed up in a tree just to get a look at Jesus, because he thought that would be as close as he would ever get to this holy man that he desperately wanted to know. The Bible says that when Jesus reached the spot where Zacchaeus was, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." Now, was Zacchaeus embarrassed or offended at Jesus for engaging with him? No, of course not. Zacchaeus was overjoyed. Like us, he was thirsting for social interaction, small talk in relationships. And thanks to Jesus stepping out and stepping up, Zacchaeus now had a relationship with the Son of God, and his life would never be the same again. As we reflect on Jesus' example and the impact it made in this man's life, think for just a moment about the potential Zacchaeuses in your neighborhood. The people who are thirsty for interaction, the people who are thirsty for relationships, the people who may be thirsty to know the Son of God. How can you prayerfully consider how you can step up in your neighborhoods in order to meet, build relationships with, and disciple the Zacchaeuses right there where you live? Well, so far we talked about the importance of stepping out and stepping up in our neighborhoods. But we'd be missing the mark if we fail to stress the importance of our final step, setting the example. As Christians, we always need to be aware of our witness in the world and how the things we say and do, for both good and bad, ultimately reflect on our faith in Jesus Christ. Because of that, we need to be focused on setting an example in our neighborhoods of what faithfulness really looks like. As Jesus himself tells us, there's no better way to set that example than by loving our neighbors like God loves us. When Jesus himself was asked what the most important thing in the whole world was, this is what Jesus told the crowd. "The most important one," answered Jesus, "is this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. Regardless of how our neighbors might treat us or avoid us, we need to treat them as if they were us and we were God. For by setting this example where we live, we can share a glimpse of what God's love looks like, all in the hopes that one day our neighbors will desire to know the fullness of that love through a relationship with Jesus Christ. Folks, that's the most important thing about being a Christian neighbor in the 21st century. We need to show our neighbors the difference that Jesus makes in our lives, and that needs to be on display through how we love the people around us. As much as our neighbors might want to know us and we them, we should want them to know Jesus more. And in lieu of getting them in the walls of a church or inviting them and involving them in a life group, living a faithful life where you live, that might be the only way that your neighbors will ever see Jesus. Because of that, each and every one of us, regardless of where we live or how old we are, we need to have these other words from Jesus on our minds and our hearts every time we interact with our neighbors. Jesus says in the Gospel of John, "A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." Friends, you should want your neighbors to know that you're a disciple of Christ. And the best way for them to know that is by setting the example and loving the people around you like Christ loves us. Now with that, I'm done preaching for the day. But as we go forth from this place and back to our neighborhoods full of people that we may or may not know, I hope you'll prayerfully consider how you can step out, step up, and set the example where you live. And as you do, I pray that you'll always remember that your neighborhood is your primary mission field. That's the place, and those are the people that you're called to reach with the love of Christ. So what are you waiting for? Step out, step up, and set the example where you live.